Good afternoon. It is a pleasure to welcome you to Georgetown's Dahlgren Chapel of the Sacred Heart. As countless Georgetown students and alumni can attest, this chapel is the spiritual heart of our university community. Generations of students, faculty, staff, and alumni have encountered God here in the sacraments and in prayer. We are pleased to collaborate with the Initiative on Catholic Social Thought in Public Life for another special virtual event, our Dahlgren Dialogue series. Coming together in this virtual fashion, we offer some time to begin and end this panel dialogue with prayer and with song, framing this hour within a place and a moment of prayer to renew our common sense of purpose, our common humanity. Today's Dahlgren Dialogue is entitled The Francis Factor at 8 Years, Global Impacts, U.S. Challenges. And it continues the conversation hosted each year since Pope Francis was elected that the Initiative on Catholic Social Thought has done. It is ever more urgent to reflect on Pope Francis as we contemplate this past year of the coronavirus storm, a global pandemic that has killed more than 2.5 million people, and just over 560,000 of them in the United States alone. Pope Francis uses this metaphor of a ship, the church, the human family, navigating the turbulent storm of this pandemic. As he said in his special and moving Urbi et Orbi address at the empty St. Peter's Piazza just about this time last year, we, like the disciples in the gospel, have been caught off guard by this unexpected storm, this tempest of disease and death. Ever since Pope Francis has made this connection between pandemic and storm, I keep coming back to one of my favorite hymns, How Can I Keep From Singing? No storm can shake my inmost calm, the refrain goes, while to that rock I'm clinging. Today's Francis Factor dialogue will look at the stormy weather of this past year, as in faith we cling to the successor of St. Peter, that rock that Christ asked to build his church. So let us bow our heads in prayer. Good and gracious God, we come to you in the midst of a pandemic, anxious but filled with hope that you are present with us, confident of your faithfulness, certain of your love and guidance in and through the ministry of your church, certain of your grace in the work of your servant, Pope Francis. You call us to be attentive to creation, to care for our common home, to find joy in the gospel, to foster love and solidarity with one another. As we begin this dialogue today, move our minds and hearts from ignorance to understanding, from isolation to dialogue, from indifference to moral responsibility. Draw us into your friendship that we might worthily praise you. Draw us into solidarity with one another that we might foster your kingdom of justice and reconciliation. May we truly be sisters and brothers to one another, disciples of mercy in this great mission of your Son, Jesus our Lord. Amen.
Thank you, Father Mark, for that welcome introduction and beautiful prayer. I hope soon we can be back in Dahlgren Dialogue. And I want to welcome everyone joining us for the Francis Factor at 8 years, Global Impacts, U.S. Challenges. We're delighted you joined us. Many people have. When we cut off RSVPs, there were 1,967, I believe. So there's a hunger and deep appreciation for Pope Francis' leadership. I want to remind you that this dialogue is being recorded, and we'll share it with you later. And you can join us on social media with the hashtag Francis Factor. 8 years ago, the world was shocked when the white smoke appeared and out walked this man that many of us didn't recognize, a Jesuit from Argentina. What were we to make of him? And the next day he told us he chose the name Francis because Francis was a man of the poor, a man of peace, and a man of creation. In these 8 years, Pope Francis has challenged us in so many ways. Such powerful images from that very first evening to his pilgrimage to Iraq just days ago. My fear, frankly, is that too much of the dialogue about Pope Francis reflects the polarization and the divisions in our church. Many of us respond to Francis by whether he affirms our own preferences and agenda rather than responding to the ways he challenges us to move beyond our own assumptions and ideologies. A few apparently are already looking to the next pope. There's books to that, there's programs about that. Some long for past popes. Our initiative is focusing on the current pope, his mission, his message, his leadership. And we have a wonderful group of people, group of leaders to help us talk about this. Dr. Michelle Gonzalez Maldonado is the Dean of the College of Arts and Sciences at the University of Scranton. She is a past president of the Academy of Catholic Hispanic Theologians in the United States. Cardinal Sean O'Malley, is the Archbishop of Boston. He is also a member of the Council of Cardinals appointed by Pope Francis, and has been a leader in responding to clergy sexual abuse in our country and around the world. Cardinal Peter Turkson will be joining us from Rome. As you know, he is the prefect, the leader of the Dicastery on Integral Human Development, and also has been asked by Pope Francis to lead the church's response to COVID-19. And finally, Cindy Wooden, who is the Rome Bureau Chief of Catholic News Service, has been in Rome for almost 3 decades. And she just returned from covering Pope Francis' pilgrimage to Iraq. It strikes me, as I thought about it, that each of you was at St. Peter's 8 years ago when Pope Francis was elected. 2 of you were in the conclave. 2 of you were in the square looking for the white soap and then waiting to see our new Holy Father. Let me begin with Cardinal Turkson and Cardinal O'Malley. You were both in the Sistine Chapel when Pope Francis was elected. Pope Francis said that evening it seems my brother cardinals went almost to the end of the earth to find a new pope. What were you looking for that took you to a Jesuit from Argentina? Who is Pope Francis after 8 years? And what is the Francis factor now after we've had 8 years of him as the leader of our church? Let me begin with Cardinal O'Malley. You were in that room, almost all of us, except for Cardinal Turkson, were not. What was it like, and what were you looking for, and what did we get?
Well, in my lifetime, I've lived through many pontificates, and each one is very, very different from the one before. And I think as we gathered in the Sistine Chapel, we had the advantage of being able to have conversations among the cardinals beforehand. Many of us in the world were shaken by the resignation of Pope Benedict. It was something that was very a great shock to a lot of us. But certainly Pope Francis's words in those congregations where we gathered to speak, where he talked about the need for the church not to be shut up on itself, but to go out and to carry the good news of the gospel to the world. I think that captured the imagination of the cardinals. It was a time when we were very much turned in on ourselves in the time of crisis, and And Cardinal Jorge Bergoglio reminded us of our mission and challenged us to be outward looking. And I think that it truly captured the imagination of the cardinals.
So the fact that Pope Francis spoke of a church that cannot be turned in on itself is in some ways the essence of the Francis factor. Cardinal Turkson, you were also in the Sistine Chapel, a member of the consistory. What were the cardinals looking for, and what do we get? You work with Pope Francis every day, every week. What is the Francis factor after 8 years?
So thanks for the question. I think your question refers to two moments, two experiences with Pope Francis. One, at the time of the consistory, when none of us knew, we knew something about the Pope, but not as much as we do now, and the current experience of working with him. At the time of the consistory, when we gathered in there, of course, as you know, his election didn't come at the first vote. Okay, it took 2 to 3 votes before that to get there. So I think that's, the search had already began. And personally for me, I had met Cardinal Bergoglio in one of my visits to Buenos Aires in a sanctuary in his diocese called Luján. There, visiting this sanctuary and in the church, in the sacristy, kind of looking around, Cardinal Bergoglio walks in. We had a small conversation in Italian because my Spanish wasn't terribly good. And then I associated him with a lot of work that had been done in Aparecida, where he'd been the secretary of a lot of the documents. So meeting him personally and recalling what had been, what Aparecida had produced, a new vision, emerging vision from Latin America about the church, which a little bit of it is what Cardinal Sean O'Malley just said, a church that is not auto-referential, but a church that goes out and not simply go out, but go out to the periphery in a culture and a situation where we had a lot of popular movements, grassroots movements, indigenous population and all of that. Bergoglio's sensitivity was towards some such people to make them feel included in this, as it were, Noah's Ark of salvation, as it were. And so that was Bergoglio, but that wasn't the thought that accompanied me into the conclave. The conclave, I'm not sure, I'll be frank, I wasn't sure who exactly what we're looking for. And everybody inside there has some merits that could be considered. That would make him capable, as it were, to be voted for. And we needed to just, yield to the promptings of the Holy Spirit to kind of guide our vote as we all had prayed for. So having chosen Bergoglio in these 8 years of working together, I think incidentally, he himself has just come out with a book titled Let Us Dream Together. And reading that book, he himself says a lot of stuff about himself, which explains the lines of his pontificate. He talks about a lot of disruptions in life, which sets you on a new trajectory. And he recalls in his own lifetime a lot of this movement. And so Bergoglio then comes with a lot of discernment, after which his decision and his activity is very fast. And he said that to us twice: be agile in your conduct and be concrete in what you come out with.
So Cardinal Sean said the Francis factor is looking outward. Cardinal Turkson says it's going to the margins. Michelle and Cindy, I believe you were both in the square. Cindy, you were probably running back and forth between watching for the smoke and trying to report on it. But Michelle, what was it like to be there? And as you look back, the first Pope from Latin America, given your studies, your heritage, what is the Francis factor after 8 years? And then Cindy, if you would add yours.
Great, thank you. I have to say that as I was teaching in Rome at the time, and like all good U.S. tourists, I was eating pizza in a pizzeria when suddenly there was a huge commotion in the restaurant and in the streets, and we realized that it was the announcement of the Pope. I was actually with a former student of mine who is Muslim, and we both ran to St. Peter's Square to wait for the announcement. And what really struck me was that it was one of the most global experiences I had had in terms of listening to different languages, seeing representatives of different cultures, seeing the diversity of races in the square. And really, I felt so blessed and moved by the experience, and equally as moved by my former student, who as a Muslim felt like she was a part of an important event in our human history and was so moved by the joy and excitement in the crowd. And for me, that's something that's definitive of Francis, that really this Pope has opened up the Catholic Church in so many different ways, whether it's his recent trip, whether it's that one moment, right, when he first stepped out, of making the Catholic Church more accessible, not only to many Catholics, but non-Catholics alike, truly connecting to global populations. And I think that in part emerges from his Latin American background, right? Latin America is a context where we wrestle with the fact that we as a people have emerged from this violent and unequal encounter of the Spanish, of indigenous peoples, and of slave populations. And so for us, diversity is within us. It's in our bodies, it's in our culture, it's in our spirits. And for me, sort of embracing the diversity of the church and engaging the diversity of the world is a huge aspect of the Francis Factor.
Cindy, tell us about that evening, and you've covered him for 8 years. What is the Francis Factor that you report on?
Well, I was going back and forth between the press office and the square. You have to see the smoke if you're there, you have to feel the crowd. You can't just watch it on a monitor. For me, the thing that struck me most, besides his simplicity, buonasera, good evening, and his references to himself as the Bishop of Rome rather than as the Pope. The key moment for me, the moment that symbolizes the Francis Factor for me, is when right before giving his very first apostolic blessing as Pope, he asked the people in the square to pray that God would bless him. And he bowed while waiting for our prayer. And to me, it's a sign of love and respect and of recognition that God is working in every single human being, individual and group, that is standing before him. I think it's one of the reasons why when he refers to the church as the people of God, he doesn't say just the people of God. He says, Il Santo Popolo di Dio, the holy people of God. And while, I just find in him a love and a respect and an honor for what is the way God is working in each individual, and a sense that he knows that he is standing on holy ground there.
Those are powerful witnesses. My colleague, Kim Daniels, and Anna were both there. And Kim said, when he asked for that blessing, you could hear the water of the fountains. It was so quiet. And the other image for me is the silence when he stood a year ago, alone in St. Peter's at the beginning of the pandemic. We focus so much on his words. Those 2 moments of silence were so powerful. Cardinal O'Malley, you and I have worked together for more than 40 years. Hard to believe. I say to you, if I had known you were going to be a cardinal, I would have been nicer to you. We worked together for Cardinal Hickey, one of the unappreciated great leaders of our church. Cardinal O'Malley, then Father O'Malley, was the leader of social justice and Hispanic ministry. Cardinal O'Malley was a Pope Francis bishop before there was a Pope Francis in terms of his simple lifestyle and concern for the poor. I remember he lived in a little apartment among many, many immigrants. He stood up for the poor. There was an annual mass where somebody preached for the ambassadors from Latin America, and they usually told them how important they were and how special they were. And then Father O'Malley said, you have to pay attention to human rights, and then lectured them on the gospel message of how they take care of their workers. It was not what they expected. So you are now not that priest living in an apartment. You're a member of the Council of Cardinals. You have a unique position, one of 8. What is Pope Francis trying to accomplish? What are his priorities in this 8th year? And then I want to ask you about your leadership and the Pope's leadership on clerical sex abuse. But as you watch him as a member of the council, what are his priorities? What is he trying to accomplish?
Well, he had many challenges right from the beginning, and but I think talking about his outreach to the periphery is a very important way of understanding what his pontificate is about. And even the creation of the Council of Cardinals was his desire to have firsthand information, unfiltered, coming from all over the world. And certainly his new style, which has resonated so positively with people throughout the world, is something that he wants to see a church that is truly a church of the poor and a church that is accessible. Cindy used that word, accessible. Even the Holy Father's writings are accessible to people. And the Holy Father is trying to reach out to the world and to draw us all closer together. He sees our call to take care of one another. Mercy and evangelization are 2 of the central themes in his pontificate. And yet he sees, like Christ did, that mercy is the context in which evangelization can take place. Only when people realize that we love them will they be willing to listen to our message. And so often in the past, the message of the gospel has been obscured by the worldliness or the lack of mercy of those who were trying to proclaim that gospel. And Pope Francis is calling us to live the joy of the gospel, to concentrate on the kerygma, the centrality of Christ's saving act and his presence among us. He stresses so much our being a human family, calling for unity among different peoples. And all of these things color all of the activities and decisions that he makes in the Curia. And it's very humbling to be a part of that council and to see up close the great love and the pastoral sense that he has as he moves forward.
Well, we're glad you're there. One of the things that has challenged the whole church and challenged Pope Francis is an area of enormous leadership on your part in Fall River, in Palm Beach, and certainly in Boston, which in many ways was ground zero of the clergy sexual abuse, maybe Washington now as well, sadly. You have stood up for victims and survivors and demanded accountability. This has been a tough challenge for Pope Francis. He has acknowledged major mistakes and has called for himself, for the whole church, to think and act anew about this. Why did this prove challenging for the Pope, and what steps has he taken, and what steps should he and the church continue to take to repair the moral, spiritual disaster of clergy sexual abuse?
Well, Pope Francis so often talks about pastoral conversion, and that is so necessary if we are going to be able to bring healing to the situation in our church due to clerical sexual abuse. But I think the conversion begins by listening to the survivors and the victims. Certainly in my own life, when I arrived as bishop in Fall River, I was completely in the dark about the dimensions, the seriousness, the terrible crimes and cover up that had taken place in our church. But listening to the victims and the survivors and their families had a huge impact on me. And that's why when Pope Benedict visited the United States, I wanted to take victims over to Rome to meet with him. And then he volunteered to have a meeting in Washington. And it was such an important moment in his life. And actually, after the Holy Father invited me to be part of the Council of Cardinals, the first thing I asked him to do was to meet with victims. And he did. And that had a huge impact on him. And he has reached out constantly to victims over the last 8 years. He is constantly meeting with victims, and that has really made a huge impact on his own pastoral conversion in this area. And our commission every year, we're invited to speak to the new bishops that are in what we call the Montessori for bishops. But I think the most important thing we do is to take survivors and victims to be able to speak to them directly. And,
Thank you. Placing victims at the center. I should acknowledge that when I first disclosed my own, publicly talked about my own abuse, it was Cardinal O'Malley who called me among church leaders to express apology and solidarity. Michelle, Dr. Maldonado, you're Dean of the School of Arts and Sciences at Scranton last summer. Before that, did all sorts of important things in Miami, most importantly, teaching young people. You focus on Latina, Latin America theology, Afro-Caribbean studies, third world and feminist theologies. I can't believe this. You're the editor of 10 books. And they must be good because you got 2 awards from the Catholic Press Association for them. Most significantly, you're an alumnus from Georgetown, and you got the outstanding alumnus from the Graduate Theological Union. You already talked a little bit about this, but I hope you'll expand. The first Latin American Pope. What does that mean? How does that shape his approach to the world? Who would have believed that the Pope would come to the United States through Cuba, where your relatives came from? What does it mean to have a Latin American Pope? And what does it mean for the U.S. that is increasingly a Latino church?
I think frankly, for Latin American and Latino and Latino Catholics in the United States, it means that we're being acknowledged and recognized. I mean, I think often when you look at the role of Latin America in Roman Catholic history, it's only discussed in terms of the conquest, right? We don't talk about when we think about the Catholic intellectual tradition, when we think about the great theologians and scholars that have formed our Catholic faith, people often don't think about Latin America. So from a huge, a huge moment for us is just kind of the recognition and acknowledgement of our existence, which has, the largest population of the faithful globally. And then, of course, for Latino and Latina Catholics, who many estimate within 20 years will be the majority of the church in the United States, it's having our heritage acknowledged. It's a way of saying, in Spanish, we say presente, meaning that we're present, we're here. It was a way of the church saying to us that we in the Americas are presente, right, as part of the history of the church. And I know I mentioned earlier in terms of Pope Francis's heritage, how it really has shaped him in terms of emerging from that context. But I would be remiss if I didn't say that the overwhelming poverty of Latin America and how you have so many, that the majority of the population of Central and South America and the Caribbean live in poverty is something that is very significant in shaping his worldview and his ministry and his pastoral outreach. And I think that we would be remiss if we didn't highlight how that has framed so much of his papacy.
You talked about his worldview. You talked about the big picture, the shape of the church globally. You also write about everyday Christian life. You teach your students. You write about the dangers of consumerism. How does Pope Francis challenge your students? How does he challenge all of us to live our faith, not just in the big choices, but the everyday choices that we make? How are we to live faithfully in our whole life?
One thing I always tell my students is that you are not just religious for an hour or two, depending on which church you go to, on a Sunday once a week, that your religious identity, your religion shapes everything that you do, from what you eat to what you wear, to how the rhythm of your life and your family operates. And also, I try to emphasize to students the interplay between culture, right, and our Catholic expressions, and how the diversity that is inherent within the global church. Now, in terms of Pope Francis, when we think about this culture of consumerism, it's that we here in the United States live in a culture that values objects over people. And that our value is so entrenched in our ability to be consumers. And so for us, I think his message of recognizing the full humanity of all individuals and talking about rejecting that culture that values individuals based on literally their economic worth is something that's very important. But also, as you mentioned, the importance of everyday life, right? Religion is something that we live. Our Catholicism is something that we breathe. I can't separate my Cuban heritage from my Catholicism because it was so intertwined in my household, how I was raised. And so he reminds us that it's not just the big decisions in life where our faith plays a role, it's in our everyday decisions as well.
Cardinal Turkson, you've been a good friend of the initiative. We together did a national leadership convening on sharing Catholic social teaching with universities across the country. People know you had the dicastery on integral human development. They may not know that you are in charge of the Pope Francis has asked you to lead the church's response to this global pandemic. What does Pope Francis' response to COVID-19, how does that shape his papacy? How does Pope Francis' values and principles and priorities shape the response of the church? The last year, in some ways, has imprisoned Pope Francis, but in other ways has freed Pope Francis to challenge all of us. He says we can't go back to normal. We have to use this as a source of conversion. Can you talk about how Pope Francis is challenging us to see the pandemic as an opportunity for conversion and solidarity?
Pope Francis, reactions and responses to world events have been very unique. In a way, probably in the sense that it goes back to the very beginnings of his own pontificate, when he chose the name of St. Francis as a patron instead of anything else. And that put him, as it were, in a particular optic. St. Francis, as we know, when he shed his clothing and everything, was not to move him away from the world. It was to free him to engage more fully with the world. And a little bit of that is also in Pope Francis. Pope Francis responding to world events, responds to world events and things happening out of a concern for what is always believed to be the dignity and the development of the human person in all senses. As it were, recalling the big heritage of Jacques Maritain about solidary humanism. This has always been there. Before coming to the COVID, you recall that when he became very soon after his pontificate, very early in his pontificate, the issue of migration crisis exploded. And for that also, he created a special unit to deal with this particular global issue of migration and refugees around the world. A unit that is still part of our dicastery, but under his particular direction. That was his way of engaging and responding to a global crisis. The COVID situation is something similar. In the face of the COVID situation, he himself had already been helping local Italian hospitals with a lot of assistance and care. But again, that having become global, he created this commission and we had us engaged. So what did we do? We created 5 working groups. We needed to maintain contact with local churches, listen to their experiences, what they're going through, and see and to manifest the Holy Father's own solicitude and concern and see how we can be of help. Then we set up a second working group that was to follow the impact of the pandemic on economy, on global labor, workforce, unemployment and all of that, access to public health care, the nature of our own social systems and all structures, with view to being able to talk about how the pandemic, having exposed several other social evils and pandemics in the words of Pope Francis, can emerge out of this better. So for Pope Francis, in that sense, working with him in the COVID situation is his way of responding to a global issue. And he invites us all to engage, to come together as he did in Laudato Si, to come together as a global society to deal with global issues. It's not to be done individually, but it's to be done by all of us together in our global conversation.
Thank you, Cardinal. You come from Ghana. You work at the Vatican. You have universal responsibilities. You have always taken a special interest and concern in the United States. I remember when we did our dialogue with Cardinal Gregory and African-American Catholic leaders on racism right after George Floyd was killed, you emailed me to say, can I add a word? You care about how we respond to racism, how we implement Laudato Si. My question briefly, how do you think, as someone outside the United States, that Pope Francis in particular challenges Catholics in the United States? I don't want to put you on the spot, but I am.
No,
what are the particular challenges for U.S. Catholics in responding to Pope Francis?
I think Pope Francis challenges Catholics all over the world. It's not just United States. There's not a single Catholic who before Pope Francis would not feel challenged. A few things in his legacy will always come out as a challenge. His decision, for example, to drop all the trimmings of the papacy. Okay, papacy, it doesn't wear the special ring of popes. It doesn't wear a sash, particularly with a stem of a pope. The red shoes are gone. The black shoes is moved out of the papal palace. He lives in Santa Marta. All of those are challenges in a way. And coming to a challenge, his respect for the dignity of the human person, as I mentioned already, solidary humanism has been with him from day one. For him, upholding the dignity of every person is the one thing that matters. And this he does in his use of the parable of the Good Samaritan, which has become an special gospel for him. All of it is to show concern for people in whatever situation they find themselves in. So in the case of the United States, this is a cultural feature that is probably out there. It manifests itself differently in other places. Like in Africa, we'll be talking about ethnicity and tribalism. But these are challenges to the fraternal sense of the human race, the fraternal feeling that we should have towards one another. In the case of the US, it's racism. Other parts of the world will be ethnicity, will be tribalism and all. So these are obstacles. These are obstacles to our living as a family of brothers, as it were, created as such by God. So this challenge then is the United States and to the rest of Christians all over the world.
Thank you. We have lots of questions and we're going to get to them. In fact, we're going to extend our dialogue a few minutes to make sure we get to as many questions as we can. But before we do that, I want to ask a couple questions of Cindy Wooden. Cindy, you've been covering the Vatican for 30 years. You're the first woman bureau chief for Catholic News Service. Most remarkably, among the four of us, you've spent the most time with Pope Francis over the last month. You and your colleagues had almost an hour with Pope Francis, and then you covered him when you went to Iraq. I have sort of three questions. I'm going to do it quickly. What was it like to spend an hour with Pope Francis? Secondly, people told Pope Francis not to go to Iraq. Why did he ignore that advice? What was it like? And what do you think the impact is? And then this week, we had this document for the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith on blessings for same-sex unions, saying that was not permitted. Can you tell us what it was like to be with him? What was that trip like? And what was this controversy this week all about? And then we'll move on to other questions. So.
Goodness gracious. That's what I can say. The members of the Rome Bureau of Catholic News Service, 6 of us, met with the Holy Father February 1st. It was planned last fall as a rather formal audience to mark the 100th anniversary of the news service. And people were supposed to come from the Bishops' Conference in the United States. And in fact, the Pope had prepared a speech. It was supposed to be 15 minutes. And instead, because the others couldn't come and it was just the 6 of us and we all speak Italian, we met in the Doma Santa Marta and had a conversation. And it was touching and amazing and funny, and gave us a chance to ask him questions about his health, about the United States, about his view of Catholic media, and about the trip to Iraq. He said then, and he said again on the plane coming back, that he felt like he could not disappoint the Iraqi people. The trip had originally been, the idea for the trip, it was supposed to take place in 2020, but the pandemic made that impossible. Once the pandemic started, once it seemed like things were going better and that a vaccine was on the horizon, the team that plans the trips started traveling back and forth to Iraq and setting things up. And by the time the third wave of infections started in November, the events and the itinerary had already been announced. And he said he prayed about it. He talked to people. He prayed about it some more, but he just felt like he could not disappoint the people. I think that his message, which is something he actually mentioned on the balcony the night he was elected, was fraternity or kinship, as you know, the idea that if we believe in one God, creator and father of all, then we are brothers and sisters to each other, and we have to act like it. He honored and consoled the Christian communities in Iraq who have been so harshly tried over the last 20 years, who have suffered so greatly. But he challenged them to honor the sacrifice of the Christians who have died by living their faith and not giving into revenge or even, resignation. I think for me, it was amazing to go to Ur, where Abraham was from, where the Christianity, Judaism, and Islam all see their roots there. But I think probably one of the most impactful, lasting moments of the trip was the fact that Ayatollah al-Sistani welcomed the Pope into his home. And the meeting lasted like twice as long as it was expected to. The photos and video went everywhere. It says to the Iraqi people that Christians and Muslims have something to talk about. They must cooperate and dialogue to build the future of the country. Oh,
What about this document that came from the CDF, Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith? Where did it come from? What did it say? What role did Pope Francis play in this?
These are some of these questions I think I should let the cardinals deal with. The document that everybody's talking about is a response to questions that were made to the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith about whether or not the church could bless same-sex marriages. Some people have said that it was occasioned by discussion of these blessings, the possibility of the blessings in Germany. Others are saying that, that there were bishops in the United States who wrote to the CDF trying to get a clarification before anything, before anybody went ahead and did it. They don't specify that. They say that while the church must respect homosexual people, provide pastoral care to them, while they're welcome to be, they should be involved in the life of the church. The church cannot bless any form of union or partnership that is not sacramental marriage between one man and one woman who pledge themselves to each other for life and are open to having children. They go. I found it interesting that the text, I think for the first time, something from the doctrinal congregation acknowledges that there may be positive aspects of these relationships. They don't spell it out, but you can imagine fidelity, sacrifice, love and care for one another. But these unions, because they are not sacramental marriages, they cannot be blessed. The individuals in the marriages can be, like, anytime they would go to mass, they would be blessed. And we all seek God's blessings as we move forward, as we try to live our faith.
Thank you for that. We have lots of questions. We have questions on nonviolence, on vaccines, about the Biden administration and Pope Francis, on the role of women, on poverty and the economy. But we have a number of questions on what Cindy was talking about in this document. And those questions are not really about the document. They're about the humanity, the dignity, the place of LGBTQ people in our community of faith, whether in fact the church is open to them. I would invite any of the folks in the dialogue to comment either on the document and what it means, but more importantly, on the implications of this for a pope who said, "Who am I to judge?" Who said civil unions might be in the secular arena a possibility. What would you say to our colleagues, our friends, members of our family who are disappointed by this particular document? Any of you can jump in at this point.
I think Pope Francis has tried to show his desire for what he calls vicinanza, to be close to people in the reality and the challenges of their lives, no matter what that may be. At the same time, the Church has a very clear teaching about marriage that needs to be proclaimed, and I think the Holy Father it tries to be very sensitive and pastoral in his outreach to people and to show his concern about individuals, and at the same time, his commitment to fidelity to what the Church's teaching is about the sacrament of marriage.
No, okay, I think it's in the same line as Cardinal Sean O'Malley. And part of it, I think Cindy traced out, the part of Pope Francis in this regard, a great respect for the dignities, calling on families to welcome their children who may have some such tendencies and all of that. So the sympathy is there. The concern and the solicitude, of the Pope for such people are there. But there is also, on the other hand, the Church as a path to salvation. The Church as a path to salvation, first and foremost, need to recognize that the path to salvation is not constituted by, the leadership of the Pope or the pastors or anybody in the Church, but by what? Scriptures and Revelation have always provided about the path to salvation. Indeed, it was St. Augustine who says that when Jesus talks about being the way, the truth, and the life, it points to two things: to what Jesus was with the Father, that is truth and life, and for what he's become for humanity when he became incarnate of the Blessed Virgin Mary to become the way to this truth and to this life. So that's what we're invited to do. For the Church to be Church, a part of salvation, it needs to recognize that the truth that it disposes and places people as a part of salvation is not something that it devolves herself. And the challenge I think that we're involved in is recognizing the dignity and upholding all of this of all people to be still humbly recognized in this regard. I made an experience with two such people from London who lead a Catholic community of gay parish in London, recognized by the Cardinal Archbishop of London and all. So one is a former Franciscan, the other one used to be a leader of Catholic agency. So the two came to our office, visited with us, and they said that's what they are, and they lead this community. But out of respect for the sacrament, for what marriage is as a sacrament, they've decided not to ask for marriage. So you can have this coming from the gay community itself, recognizing the nature, the sacredness of that as a sacrament to not. So there are people within that community who recognize the, as it were, the theological sense or the salvation of a sacrament as a part of salvation. It's not to say that those who do not recognize are not on the path to salvation, but it's to recognize in whatever state of life we live in, at a certain point, we need to bring it all to the Lord and have the Lord evaluate it for us. And that's what I think this one is about. It's not calling anything sinful or anything evil, but whatever state or situation we live in, every now and then it's good to bring it to revelation, to the word of Scripture, and have the Lord, as it were, scan it all for us.
Thank you for that. There are a wide variety of perspectives on this, and clearly this touches our hearts because it touches the people we love.
Yeah, right.
Let me ask about racism. We've had this experience in the United States of these murders in Atlanta. We don't know everything about it, but 8 people dead, 6 Asian American women. The trial of George Floyd is going on in my hometown of Minnesota. Our church is a diverse church. Cardinal O'Malley, you served in the Virgin Islands. You're a leader. There's a new racial justice initiative in Boston. This is something, Michelle, you have worked on your whole life. How does our church move under the leadership of Pope Francis to the kind of fraternity, friendship, solidarity that includes everyone, especially people who are different than us. We just talked about our sisters and brothers who are gay and lesbian and transgendered. What about people who are a different race, a different ethnicity? How do we follow his leadership in building fraternity and solidarity? Cardinal O'Malley, you're doing some remarkable things in Boston.
In Fratelli Tutti, the Holy Father holds up as wonderful examples for us Gandhi, Martin Luther King, and Charles de Foucauld. And when he spoke to the Congress in Washington, one of the American heroes that he held up was Martin Luther King. He certainly has an awareness of our great challenge in the United States of racism, sort of our original sin. And yet he also is holding up an antidote to that, which is this solidarity, fraternity, and the sense of community, which is the only thing that will be able to end this terrible scourge of racism in our midst. And in that same encyclical, where he talks about Charles de Foucauld and how he discovered being a universal brother like St. Francis through his experience, a deep mystical experience of the incarnation. This is who we are. The Christ's incarnation has transformed us and connected us in such a marvelous way. And the Holy Father, in so many ways, he speaks with gestures more eloquently than with words. But I remember when he had that Wednesday audience and he saw Vinicio Rivas in the crowd, a man who was covered with terrible sores, and he went out to him and embraced him and kissed him. And afterwards, that man said to the newspaper people, "When I got on a bus, no one will sit next to me." And he said, when the Holy Father came and embraced me, it made me realize that God loved me. And this is the message of Francis's life and pontificate, that we are here to be a reflection of God's love and mercy to each other. And in so many of his words and his gestures and his teachings, he's underscoring that. And until we begin to listen to that, we're never going to be able to overcome this scourge of racism in our midst here in the United States.
Michelle, you have done work in this area. You also have done a lot of work in terms of immigration. These are different issues, but they overlap. How can Pope Francis challenge us to resist racism, to be a more welcoming community?
Well, I think, to quote Fratelli Tutti as well, when he talks about the fact that racism is a virus that mutates, right? And instead of disappearing, goes into hiding, he's reminding us that the work is never over, right? And that really we need to understand, and part of that is understanding our history in the church, in our institutions. I think Georgetown is doing a wonderful work in terms of reckoning its complicity in the transatlantic slave trade. And so part of it is knowing our history, acknowledging it, and moving forward from that, right? But in an informed way. And in addition, to tie it into the theme of immigration, I'm very, and I think this speaks to racism as well. I'm very informed by the work of the Jesuit Greg Boyle, who's founder of Homeboy Industries. And in his last book, he talks so much about that we need to open the circle of compassion and kinship so that all are included as equals, right? And so we have to really interrogate how we benefit from white privilege, white supremacy, both as individuals and in social structures and in our churches, how we're complicitous in that, and really try to reimagine a world of compassion and kinship, ultimately grounded in our Catholic theology.
Cindy, we have a whole bunch of questions. Let me throw a couple of them at you, and anybody can join in. We have a question about vaccines. Is it moral to be vaccinated or immoral not to be vaccinated? The Vatican has spoken on this. I know so have the bishops. The role of women in the church, there's been some developments there. And then I'll ask the whole group to respond to these. And then the other question is, where are the areas of potential agreement and common effort on the part of the Biden administration and Pope Francis and the Vatican? Where are the areas of conflict and how can those be managed? So, excuse me, just a few minor things: vaccines, the role of women, and then Biden and Pope Francis. I'll start out with Cindy, but I'm asking each of you to pick one or several of those.
Okay, on vaccines, the Vatican has said, kind of the baseline is that it is an individual choice. However, they also say that each of us has an obligation to protect ourselves, our families, and our communities. Therefore, if you decide not to be vaccinated, you must take every measure possible, including wearing masks, self-isolating, being careful about social distancing and crowds. You must be super serious about doing that if you've decided not to vaccinate yourself, because there are people out there who cannot receive the vaccine because of their immune suppressed status, perhaps pregnant people, things like that. As far as the morality of the vaccines, given their connection to cell lines that were developed from fetal tissue of abortions 50 years ago, the Vatican has said that that connection is so remote that individual Catholics do not have to feel morally troubled by receiving those vaccines. And bishops around the world have agreed with that. The vaccines are there to protect us and everyone else, and getting vaccinated is one sure way of getting us out of this mess.
Thank you for that clarity. Cardinal O'Malley, Cardinal Turkson, could you offer a comment on potential collaboration between Pope Francis and the Vatican and the Biden administration and potential conflict?
Certainly in the area of Laudato Si, and the Biden administration has announced that they're going to re-engage with the Paris Accord. That is a very important area where the Holy See, I'm sure, will be anxious to work with the United States as with other countries. Certainly, the area of immigration is a very important one. The Holy Father, also talking about the vaccine, is asking countries to share their resources. There are over 100 countries where there's been no vaccinations at all yet because of lack of the vaccines. And the Holy Father is certainly challenging the United States and European countries to share their resources.
So just, if I may just tag on to this, just, carrying from what the Cardinal just observed upon, I think there's one thing that the two leaders, bring to the table is that in the culture of encounter. The Holy Father very much deals with the culture of encounter. Going to the peripheries is always to encounter the other one. And the decision to go back to the COP21 decisions that we all following the trip of the new Secretary of State to Korea and the attempt made to engage with North Korea and all of that. There's also a characteristic culture of encounter that's also showing through, that's also being developed. There is also the thing about, for everything that is said, one also observes a very deep sense of prayer in the present president of the United States. His first gesture on coming into Washington was to pray for all the victims of the COVID. And the trust to prayer and rooting one's ministry in prayer is something that is true of Pope Francis, as apparently is also true of the present president. So the relationship then on that account between the two, and the likelihood that the two probably can hopefully meet someday, sit down together and chat, it's a big thing that will probably be, that can signal a lot of common pathways together and have the two of them, come up form a common vision for a universal, a global community and human family.
Pope Francis is a man of engagement, encounter, and dialogue. And one of the things that's been clear is all those things involve looking for common ground, but also acknowledging differences. So we will have areas of great agreement and collaboration. And then there are areas like some of the pro-life agenda where the administration and the church have fundamental differences. Religious liberty should be an issue where we can find common ground, but it's going to take a lot of work. Michelle, I'm going to ask you to bring our dialogue to a close. You can talk about any of these, the role of women, the potential relationship between Biden and Pope Francis, vaccines, if you wish. But I'd also like you to think, what if someone's watching this? There are a couple thousand people watching this, and they're thinking, Pope Francis moves me. How can he move us to action? Is there one or two things that we can do to have the Francis factor change our lives in modest ways?
Well, I think briefly, being in Scranton, I have to mention something about Biden because it seems somehow wrong not to bring him in. I will say, I think on the issue of immigration, that this would be an important place where we can see the church and have seen the church here in the United States attempt to be a prophetic voice to recognize the full humanity of the children and men and women who are seeking asylum in this country. And so there, I do hope that that this can be a very concrete space where the Biden administration can be informed by and really listen to our teachings about love of neighbor and remembering that these are our neighbors. But broadly, that issue raises the question of action. I think that Pope Francis, you mentioned it's his gestures often, it's those moments, it's not his words that have such a huge impact. And I think that for us, it's a challenge to not become complacent, right? And only to sort of intellectualize or denounce. And really to say that we are called to action, to respond to the immense suffering that we are living through and have been living through since the beginning of the pandemic. And that is on a global scale. I mean, there has never been a year that has brought us together for unfortunate reasons in such concrete ways as recognizing ourselves as a human community. So my hope is like him, we can embody that in what we do and not just in what we say.
That call to action is a great way to bring this lively dialogue to a conclusion. We could go on for a long time, but we won't. I want to thank our panel, the Cardinal O'Malley, Cardinal Turkson, Dr. Maldonado, and our friend Cindy Wooden. I want to thank Anna and Kim, my colleagues. I want to thank our colleagues in the Office of Mission and Ministry, especially Father Mark Bosco and John Crowley Clark. I also want to remind you, we have some upcoming attractions. We're going to do later in the month a session on pluralism, religious liberty, and the common good with experts and advocates and officials. And then we have a Latino leadership gathering for young Latinos to talk about where do we go after COVID. This is a Dahlgren Dialogue. It's not just another discussion. We began in prayer, and we're going to end in song. And Father Mark and his colleague, John Crowley Buck, have helped us end in prayer and song by bringing to us the Dahlgren Chapel Choir chorus singing, sharing, How Can I Keep From Singing? It was arranged by Taylor Davis, and it's directed, the choir is directed by Dr. Russell Weissman. I want to thank all of you for joining us, and I ask you to join us as we sing and listen to our closing prayer. Thank you.